Do you think you would be able to tell if someone was lying to you? Do you think by looking at someone's face, their micro-expressions, their tone of voice, even what words they used, you might be able to pick if you were being swindled, being lied to, being manipulated, being groomed? I certainly struggle reading people. It's one of the things that I've been having to deal with my entire life. However, my podcast guest this week is an absolute expert. In fact, he's easily one of the best in the world. Steve Van Aperen is also known as the Human Lie Detector. He has worked with law enforcement all over the world. He trains law enforcement all over the world in the delicate art of interviewing criminals who are trying to convince you that they didn't do it. And let me tell you, if you've done it, Steve's going to find out. It's a fascinating conversation, and I can't wait to share it with you. Steve Van Aperen is also known as the Human Lie Detector. I've had the good fortune to have worked with Steve in my TV work. He has shown up on some of the shows that I work on, and every time he does, I have the most extraordinary conversations with him because he truly is a fascinating reader of humans. I mean, he's Keanu in The Matrix. He sees through everything, and it is incredible. He trains some of the highest level law enforcement on the planet, the LAPD, the FBI, the US Secret Service. He has been involved in hundreds and hundreds of criminal cases, some of the most grisly homicides you can possibly imagine. He has interviewed some of the most heinous criminals on the planet, and he does these things because he has this extraordinary ability to observe the way a person's face moves, how they use words, their tone of voice, the tense of the nouns and verbs that they use when they speak. He has a way of questioning and a way of obtaining a baseline that allows him to quite clearly see if someone done it. It's an incredible conversation. He's understandably an intense cat. You know, his job is to stare down the most gruesome, horrific criminals in our society that do some of the most awful things that we probably prefer not to think about. But that's his job, is to bring justice and hopefully at least peace of mind to the families of the victims who have been lost. And because of that, I should warn you straight away, this conversation talks about some really heavy stuff. I'm talking about homicide, child homicide, pedophilia, grooming, the grooming of children for abuse. It goes on and on and on. Because you can't have a conversation about manipulation, about lying, without kind of going to those places, because that ultimately is where Steve does his most important work. It's interesting speaking to him because I got the feeling that he is not unaffected by spending time with some of these people who've committed these crimes. But still, for someone who has seen what he's seen, heard what he's heard, he manages to carry on and keep doing work because he ultimately is trying to bring the families of the victims of these criminals some peace. And I really got that feeling that is what drives him. Steve's retired from law enforcement these days. He works as a consultant. He's brought in from time to time to interview particularly tricky subjects. But he does go around in the corporate world teaching the interviewing skills that he has learned. Some of them he's developed to people not only in the security industry, but to people in all kinds of industries, because ultimately to read a person is to get information, and to get information is to be able to make a better choice and a better decision. It's a fascinating chat, and I was really grateful to have it because particularly the stuff he spoke about with grooming, some of the insidious ways that grooming can happen, not just of children, of adults as well. I think it's worth listening to. And it, like I said, it's tough going at times, but I think it's worth listening to. Not to say that the boogeyman's everywhere and every time you pick up the phone or answer a DM from a stranger, that's what's happening. But to know some of the techniques that get used is to be armed against the techniques that get used, which is why I'm grateful to bring you this conversation with Steve Van Aperen. I'm really grateful we finally got the time to do this, mate. I'm stoked that we can get a chance to sit down and talk. Where do we find you today, Steve?
St Kilda Road, Melbourne, looking over sunny Melbourne.
Did you start growing up in the growing up part of your life in Melbourne or not?
Yeah, I'm Melbourne born and raised. My father was actually the head keeper of Melbourne Zoo, and we lived for a
Wow.
little while there. And sadly, he passed away when I was 4. And I lived in South Australia for a while. I was in the police department over there, and then come back to Melbourne, joined Victoria Police.
I've only seen the zookeeper living at the zoo in storybooks or films, but you were a toddler and your dad was the head zookeeper and you were at the Melbourne Zoo.
Correct. And I still have vivid memories of actually swimming in the hippo pool, having lion cubs in the backyard, and mum having platypuses in the bath and all sorts of stuff. So it was quite an interesting upbringing, to be honest.
So, hippos are the most dangerous animal on the planet, and that's not hyperbole. They kill more people than anything. Well, I'm assuming there was no hippos in the pool at the time.
Absolutely not. They can be very violent, but no, that was while the enclosures were being cleaned and whatnot. But yeah, very fond memories.
Wow, that's. I haven't been in Melbourne Zoo in a long time, but I love taking our little boy Wolfie to the zoo. It's so wild. It's just the most wonderful thing to just sit there and just marvel at nature. But losing your dad that early, I mean, you don't know any different, but that must have been pretty tough. As you got older, I'm sure it started to kick in once you kind of got to your teens and you saw the relationships that other guys were having with their dads. Did that kind of affect you, do you think?
Yeah, look, it did, because the circumstances were my mother was a nurse and she used to work night shift, and I remember my older brother, Ian, who was 4 years older than I am, said to me, "Go wake up Dad." And I went to wake up Dad. And I still remember this, even at the age of 4. I went down to the bedroom, tried to wake him, and he didn't wake up. And I went back and told my brother, and he said, "Try again." And I must have gone up and down 3 or 4 times. And then I remember walking in, sitting on the bed, and then Ian turning on the lights. And he was sitting there. And of course, at that age, you have no idea what death is. And I remember Ian saying he's dead. And it was quite monotone. And I think he understood what death meant, but I don't think he understood the emotional ramifications of it. And the only thing I remember after that is an ambulance out the front of the house. Yeah, that was it. But it was funny. I'm a big golfer, and going back about a year ago, a very good friend of mine and his father played golf, and I just looked at the relationship between the two of them, and probably for the very first time in my life, I thought, I wonder what it would be like to play golf with a father that I never knew. So yeah, that was interesting. I it's funny because everything I've learnt about him has been through other people. And ironically, when I was a detective at Broadmeadows, I was investigating a burglary, and just walked in and started talking to the guy, and the guy said, "Oh, you're Bill Van Apren's son, are you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he used to work with him, my father. And it was almost surreal learning about my own father through someone that I couldn't even remember. So yeah, so I've got about 2 photos of him. So that's the first time I was
Wow,
introduced to death, and ironically, my career took a path where I'm surrounded in homicides and death.
mate, that. Well, look, I'm sorry you went through that. I know you were quite little, but to discover your dad in bed dead, that's hard to do. I mean, you didn't know any different, but as you grew up, I'm sure you could have understood what, certainly as you would have done your job and seen the effects that has on other people, you would have definitely, I'm sure it would have helped you find some empathy towards people who lost parents or loved ones when they were quite young.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having, as you know, I've worked on about 81 homicide cases and a couple of serial killer investigations, and the media make such a big deal. I know people have this fascination with murder, intrigue, and mystery, and all that type of thing. I actually see the other side. I see the pain and the suffering of the victims' families, and
Yeah.
yeah, a great deal of empathy is required. And I make no bones about the fact that, and I'm I still have nightmares even to this day. I average around about 4 hours sleep a night, and I have terrible nightmares. I really do. And I think stress is a personal issue. I think everyone's got their own coping mechanisms with stress. And I've worked with some really good, strong characters. So these are tough guys, like homicide detectives, robbery, armed robbery, and so on. And that there was no outlet. I remember when I was in the police, and I was 21, and here I was at 21 preparing a body for a viewing, because back in those days they didn't have public servants that did it. Police used to have to do it, and I remember going to a really bad car accident, and a young girl was killed. And here I was at 21, 22, she was so badly, injured and, from the accident that, trying to cover it. So when the parents come in to do the ID, that they weren't, obviously it was horrific for them anyway, but to use empathy is so important, especially when you've lost a loved one or a child. I could think of nothing worse. But yeah, I think it did help me building empathy and in the future.
People know you because you have an ability to read unconscious tells in people's faces and tones of voice and choice of words, and that is very clear, like Neo in the Matrix. You can just go, all right, you think you're not telling me what you're telling me, but I can see you're telling me what you're telling me.
And this is why I have no friends left.
Well, we can talk about that. But when did you first start to notice? Because my wife has, Audrey, she has an astonishing ability to read micro expressions.
Yep.
To the point where she'd be like, what, you didn't see that? I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. You didn't see the flash of regret go across her face between the word but and I am? No, I didn't. She goes, no, that person's really sad that they did that. Well, I don't know. But so when did you first start to notice that you could see things that other people couldn't in others' faces?
Yeah, it was when I first joined the police, and I was interviewing somebody, and my partner said, that guy's lying. He said, I hate liars. And the first thing I thought was, well, you're in the wrong occupation. You're going to get lied to every day of the week. But it was during an interview, and it was really funny because I thought, you know what? Forget about all the micro expressions, the telltale signs, the body language, the pronouns, the narratives, all that sort of stuff. Usually what trips up a liar is the fact that they're contradicting themselves. So the story didn't add up. Right. So then I thought to myself, and it was interesting because I went through 2 police departments, detective training school, and then I went and trained in adaptive interviewing, which is a process used by the FBI. And what I realised was interviewing is your bread and butter. I mean, sometimes you'd be interviewing a witness who turns out to be an offender or vice versa. So, the first thing is to be able to identify certain cues and signs and behaviours. So, I can teach anyone in half an hour how to be a good question askers. But what I teach homicide investigators, investigation, intelligence agencies, government departments is not to be a question asker, but to be an analyst of human behaviour. So if I ask a question, the question is threatening stimulus that induces changes, and the person's evasive, omissive, dismissive, sidesteps the issue, doesn't answer the question. There's hand-to-face, masking, concealment, blocking behaviours, paralinguistic changes. Well, then that's important because I think, what is it about those changes, or about that question that induced those changes? But more importantly, why haven't they answered the question? Yeah, so it was an organic process. And then I thought, you know what? I'm not the best interviewer. I thought I was great. But at the end of the day, how do you measure the effectiveness of an interview? I mean, I watch a lot of journalists interview people all the time. They'll ask the question. The respondent won't answer the question. They'll go on to the next one. I mean, I was analysing the Prince Andrew interview, and look, even the average person could see there was a lot of inconsistencies there. But I mean, I sat there and I think I found about 92 significant changes in behaviour during the interview. So, yeah, so I just thought, you know what, I want to be, I was always interested in profiling, but what had happened was the more I learned about profiling, the more interested I become in cognitive and behavioural interviewing. I wanted to know why some of the detectives were terrible at reading people or detecting deception, and why some were quite good. But more importantly, what is it about some interviewers where people would confess? And, the funny thing is I got back from the States and all of a sudden I had all these people confessing. And when you understand why people confess, I think you've cracked the code.
Okay, so I'll ask the obvious question here. What makes people want to confess? Is it the pressure of holding up the just eternal amounts of spinning plates to maintain the subterfuge, and they just don't have enough RAM and they can't think about, I don't have the brain power to find the keyhole in my front door because I'm too busy remembering what I've told everybody?
To a small extent, there's been research done. The three main reasons why people confess. Number one, believe it or not, they like the interview. Number two, to get it off their chest. Number three, they believe that the evidence is so overwhelmingly against them that further resistance may be futile. So think about that for a second. So the first thing I do is I want the person I'm interviewing to like me. I want them to take me into their confidence and I want them to feel comfortable. Secondly, and we know this, if I blame somebody for their behaviour, I make it substantially more difficult for them to confess. Because humans, as we are very good at minimising, justifying, and rationalising our behaviour, in particular when we've done something wrong. So, as an interviewer, when I go in to interview somebody, the first thing I will do is build that rapport and empathy. Number one, even if I don't like the person, point number one, never let that show, especially if I'm interviewing a pedophile or someone like that. It's important because I remember a good colleague of mine, a friend as well, we were interviewing this well-known pedophile here in Melbourne. And my partner says, if you don't tell us what you did to this child, we're going to lock you up, you're going to go to jail, your wife will leave you, you'll lose your job, and no one will want to have anything to do with you. Now, just think about that for 1 second. He just gave 1,000 reasons why not to confess, not one reason why he should or could. So my partner gets up, storms out, good cop, bad cop. And I don't say anything. I'm just writing. And this guy looks at me and he says, after like a real long pause, and silence in an interview is really important, believe it or not, because we're very social creatures. We don't like pregnant pauses in conversations or interviews. So anyway, he walks out, he looks at me, and he asked me a very interesting question. And the question was, now bear in mind, we had no evidence. We had no biological trace evidence, no fingerprints, no CCTV. We had nothing. We just had hearsay. And he said, do you think I did this? My response was, I looked at him and I said, you know what? I don't really care if you did this. I've only got one question and one question only. He says, what's that? I said, did you mean to hurt her? And he does this, just very, very slight shake of the head in the negative. So now I've got a partial admission. So it's understanding the psychology of what makes people do what they do can only make me a better interviewer. But also, I'll use behavioural analysis questions. So let's just say I'm interviewing you for, I don't know, a theft. You know? So I'll say, and let's just say it's $20,000 gone missing from the boss's office. I'll ask you behavioural analysis questions like the FBI use. It might be, Osher, what do you think should happen to the person who took that money? Now, think about that question for a second. Let's say you are not involved, you didn't take that money. You'll give me an opinion of what you think should happen. And usually it might be, depending on your upbringing, your values, your morals, religious beliefs, and so on. You might say, give them a second chance, or you might say, they should call the police, or whatever the issue is. Usually what we find is truthful people will say what they really feel. They know they're not going to get into trouble for the actions of someone else if they're not involved. Whereas deceptive people will often come up with a justification, an excuse, or some sort of mitigation. So it might be, or maybe they didn't mean for it to happen. I've had people say things like that. So how people answer the question, or another one would tell me, Osher, who would you eliminate from this investigation? Truthful people will always say, well, I didn't do it. And they'll actually vouch for other people they like, know, and trust. So they'll say it wouldn't be Paul because Paul wasn't even in the office on the day. It wouldn't be Joe because Joe's not that sort of person. It wouldn't be Wendy because, Wendy's no way would Wendy do anything like that. Now think what's happening there. A truthful person is exonerating or eliminating other people from the investigation. A deceptive person will never do that. You eliminate other people. Who's left in the focus? Myself or yourself. So it's understanding the psychology. It's more about analysing the response, asking the right questions, and looking at how they react to the question.
when you're looking at how they react, and this is the thing that fascinates me, because you see things that you see things that are in plain sight, and even though you say to me, it's like, no, watch their blink rate. I'm like, all I see is their eyes opening and closing. I can't tell if it's faster or slower. What do things like, I don't know, what do things like blink rate or which way our eyes are pointing or things like that tell us when we're speaking to another person?
Oh, well, the first thing is you need to baseline or benchmark a behaviour and then look for deviations from that normative behaviour. So let's just say, let me ask you a question. What was the very first job you ever had?
I worked for my dad
Yeah.
as answering phones in his office on a Saturday.
Okay. And what year did you start?
1980, I was 11, 5.
Okay. Now, if you were to play that video back, your eyes went down,
Yeah,
rotated, then went up to the right. Now,
they
that
did.
that in itself, right? That in itself tells me very little. But what it does tell me is this, right? A lie, by definition, is where you willfully mislead somebody, knowing that what you're saying is factually incorrect. Right? Now, usually what I do if I'm talking on stage or something, I'll get people out of the audience and I'll ask them a question, and I'll actually stop them before they answer the question. And I'll say, okay, that just goes to prove that loss of eye contact is not indicative of deception, but more so of neurological recall. In fact, research shows the opposite. Research shows a deceptive person will more likely stare you down than look away. It's more about confidence. Different cultures, people may look down, all the rest of it. So that's why it's so important to benchmark and then look for deviations from that normative behaviour. So holistically, we need to look for groups of things. But getting back to eye blink rate, eye fixation, all that type of thing, research shows that, believe it or not, a person's blink rate increases 6 to 8-fold after the delivery of the deception. So it's almost like what will happen is I'll give you the response I know I'm lying to, and I'll think, well, how is Osher reacting to that? And all of a sudden, it's almost like reaction and relief. So our body has our autonomic nervous system. So it's sympathetic and parasympathetic.
Yeah.
So if we're ever threatened, we go into fight or flight mode. And depending on the circumstances, it's interesting when I interview somebody, if you haven't baselined that, you're not going to see those changes. But bear in mind, what you said before about Audrey, or your wife, research shows that women have more evaluation centers in their brain than men. That's why they're so much better at reading body language. You know, one of my most popular talks on the speaking circuit is why women make better liars and men have no idea. So, and one of the things I talk about is when a woman is interested in a man, she will bombard him with behavioural cues that signify that interest. The problem with men is they have no idea. They don't know what to look for. So women will be putting it all out there. There'll be good frontal alignment. There'll be a touching. There'll be the psychological free space of communication. And men have does she like me? Oh, no. Whereas all the cues and signals are there. So that would account for why women are so much better at reading body language than men.
In your experience, when it comes to people who are incredibly good liars, is this something that they are deliberately crafting, or is it just a set of skills that they have they just do automatically in order to protect themselves? They're not deliberately doing it. Oh, if I do this or do that, I am going to make them believe this. Or is it just this kind of almost subconscious wriggling out from underneath a truth to create another truth in order to protect themselves? They're so in it, they don't even realize they're doing it.
Yeah, look, I'm sure all your listeners would know someone in their past where they've lied, and their lies are just totally unbelievable. So that could be part of their narcissistic personality. It's really interesting because there are different levels. I mean, you've got psychopaths, you've got sociopaths and all the rest of it. So usually what happens is people will tell you what they want you to know. That's the first thing. So effectively, what I think is that those people that maintain the facade, let's just say, somebody's on a dating site or something like that. Well, a lot of the times, and my former business partner, I remember once she went out with a guy on a dating site, gets back to me, they go out somewhere, wherever, and she comes back and she says, he said on his side that he was 6'2", he goes to the gym, And he was very buffed. They were his own words. And when she actually met him, he was 5'7", had a pot belly, and she said, using her words, teeth like a serrated steak knife. So the interesting thing, there is people will lie to impress, to get ahead, to save face, to maintain the facade, and often, depending on the personality trait, they may actually believe their lies. They really do. It's got to a state. Everyone around them doesn't, but they and they maintain that facade. But you've got to be mindful too, because you're right. Often deceptive people will trip themselves up because they're inconsistent in what they've previously said. And you know what? If I was to ask you what you did this morning neurologically through sensory input and historical events, you'd be able to tell me what you saw, what you heard, what you felt, what you did, conversations that took place. Why? Because you lived through them. So usually, and I see this with a lot of cases, but if I'm getting somebody to recall a historical narrative, I'll say, tell me everything you did from the time you woke up to the time, you found the body or whatever. Then what will happen is truthful people will take ownership, whereas deceptive people will create that distance, disassociation, and separation in their language because they can't implicate themselves if they're involved. So they have to do that. They've got no option.
What do the differences of the two answers sound like, please?
Yeah. So a truthful person will give you information, content, structure, and detail, but also, most importantly, feelings and emotions. Like they'll explain how they felt when they found the body, and they may even blame themselves. Or, if this didn't happen, she would still be here, or something like that. Whereas deceptive people do the opposite. Let's talk about in Queensland, Gerard Baden Clay. Now, I don't know if you remember that case. He reported his wife went missing, and he was interviewed. Channel 9 journalist did a doorstop, and he's under the carport, and he's got a big scratch down the side of his cheek. Anyway, the journalist starts asking him questions, and what he said was, I'm really worried about my children. What he didn't say was, I'm really worried about our children. Why would you say that? Because, trust me, I've interviewed a lot of people who've had a loved one gone missing, and they will never, ever talk in singular person past tense until there's any evidence to the contrary. So it's almost like he's already eliminated his wife from his narrative by saying my children. They're still our children. So what's happened? What's different? So when I first watched that doorstop, I thought, and I was talking to a homicide detective because I consult to a lot of police departments, and I said to this detective, I said, there's no doubt in my mind he's withholding information. Sure enough, he got charged, and he was actually scratched. And I remember the excuse he said, he cut himself shaving. And so unless he was shaving with a machete, it's hard to believe.
What ended up happening to him?
He was convicted of a murder, and he's in custody. I think 20-year jail sentence.
Far out, man. You mentioned earlier, Steve, you mentioned about going on dates. And I think, I'd say you're the probably only person who's listening to this or a part of this conversation that's in homicide, in the world of homicide. So we're not going to be interviewing, perpetrators. But we're interviewing people that potentially are life partners, whenever we go on a date. Besides the obvious, and I'm back in the day when I was on those swiping dating sites, I have had that experience of like, wow, those photos were somebody else from a few years back. When we're having conversations on those, first few minutes or maybe an hour of a coffee date with somebody that we meet online and we're meeting them face to face, because it's very hard to do all this kind of stuff we're talking about over text. Like, so when we do get face to face with someone, what are some things that we can look for?
I like to break it down into three main areas, and that is verbal, non-verbal, which is body language, and paralinguistic. So firstly, with verbal, it's how we communicate with words. So obviously that's where we look for inconsistencies in their statement. So if, say, for example, I say during the thing, what'd you do last night? And say there's all these inconsistencies in the responses, like, why is that important? Well, firstly, there's no answer there. Secondly, deceptive people often take the pressure off themselves and put it back on the interviewer who's asking the question. So thirdly, I look for a denial as opposed to an objection. So an example would be, Osher, did you take that $20,000? And you say to me, no, I didn't. That's a clear-cut, direct, succinct denial using a personal pronoun. Whereas if you say, why would I do that? I'm not the sort of, you're not answering the question. Okay, so most importantly, I know this is interviewing 101, is A, whether the person is answering a question. That's without a doubt. Now, believe it or not, when I wrote my first book, there was a chapter there on intuition. And research shows that when we get a gut feel that something's not right, 90% of the time we're right. The problem is we actually talk ourselves out of it. We think, he or she can't be that bad, or, for whatever rationalization process we use, why would normally smart people invest with somebody like Bernie Madoff, promising ridiculous returns, and you're a smart person and you know that that's, pie in the sky, but you believe him. Why? And you give him your money. So that's the first. So listen to the words, what people say, how they say it. Are they taking ownership or creating that distance? Body language, look for conflict or contradiction between what they're saying and what their body language is engaging in. When I was a detective, it was amazing how much information I got because the perpetrator themselves couldn't keep their mouth shut, had to tell somebody, had to let them know. I did that stick up on the Caltech service station, big noting themselves. So I've always said, if you're going to be a good crook, don't tell anyone, which is pretty hard for a lot of people. The third one is paralinguistic, and that relates to how the message is communicated. So that might be tone, pitch, voice modulation, response latency, ums and ahs, all that type of thing. We know when people lie, it creates cognitive load, and cognitive load takes a lot of processing. I mean, if we looked at an MRI, when a person is lying, literally our brain lights up like a Christmas tree because there's so much to process. Whereas if you're just recalling historical events, you're just relying on memory alone, short and long term. So in the dating, ask the direct questions. Are you married? Do you have a partner? Are you seeing somebody at the moment? Cut the bullshit and just go straight to the main issue, right? Because people skirt around the edge.
Are you sure you weren't sitting in that cafe next to me at Venice Beach, mate? Because you would be amazed if I went, and I did it for a few months, but you would be amazed. If I went on 5 dates, 3 of these dates were with women who had boyfriends.
Yeah.
They were just looking for the next vine to swing onto before they let go of the last one. They're like, oh, no, he's on tour. What are you doing? You are in public with someone that's not your boyfriend that you live with. I don't know what kind of person he is. I don't want him coming to find me. Thank you very much. Goodbye. It was so weird, man. I did not like it one bit. Yeah, so that did actually become a question I started to ask Steve.
If there's something that doesn't feel right, ask the question. But more importantly, and this is the biggest thing, what are the observations that you've made after the question? So are they denying? Are they being evasive, omissive, dismissive, sidestepping the issue? All these changes in behavior. Because if I'm interviewing someone, and I don't care if it's a homicide or a potential date, I want to know what is it about that question that induced that change in behavior. But more importantly, why didn't they even answer the question? And, humans, we want to see the best in everyone. But the problem is we're very easily influenced. I remember interviewing a psychopath, and he murdered a 6-year-old girl, sexually assaulted and murdered her. And he just seemed like your typical grandfather. And I remember, I will never forget this. I went home that night and I had the biggest, I don't get migraines. I don't even think I knew what a migraine was. But that night I got home and I got to be honest with you, I thought my head was going to explode because this guy was sitting there and he was just playing games. He actually enjoyed the cat and mouse of it all. And we're talking about the rape and murder of a 6-year-old girl.
Oh my God. I don't know how do you even go home after a day like that and then hear bins getting full and go, yeah, it is bin night, and just carry on with regular domestic. How do you even decompress from a day like that, Steve?
Firstly, everyone's got their own coping mechanism. So what I do is I'm very good at compartmentalising. Okay. Having said that, though, I would challenge any investigator or return service people who faced some horrific scenes. I would challenge anyone who say they can just turn off. You know what? I think there's a number of things that happen. They either implode they explode, or they develop coping mechanisms, drinking alcohol, reckless behaviour, drugs, all that type of thing. But, what I do is I have escapes, golf, photography, all that type of thing. But when this phone rings, it is always bad news, always. So I have to cope with it.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've got all kinds of strategies so you don't go all Pavlovian when that phone rings, so you can be as present to the person who needs your help on the other end of the line. Your body doesn't tense up in anticipation. You probably have a thing that you do and take a breath and center yourself and go, right, someone needs help. There's somebody who's lost someone and they need my help, and I'm the only person that can give it. I'm sure that helps you, because you are very good at what you do, and I'm sure that does give you some sense of, I guess, relief, does it?
It does. I had a problem where, going back a while ago, I was just being inundated around the world. I remember I had one Canadian family, and their daughter was murdered, and the police had done an investigation, and they were pleading. They couldn't afford my airfares or anything like that. They were pleading, and I was going through a stage where I was working ridiculous hours, and I was almost like I felt like I was taking the world's problems on. And if I ever said no, I felt so bad about it. And I realized that I can't help people if I'm not right myself. I really can't. And I got to a stage where I thought I was so run down, so run down. I did a talk. I was asked to speak in Iran, believe it or not. And I was flying from Iran back to Dubai to Melbourne. I was so exhausted. Anyway, I'm walking back to my seat, and the last words I remember was the captain saying, we're coming into land, please take your seats. The next thing I remember is waking up. There were paramedics around me. The captain of the plane was looking down at me. There was a couple of flight attendants looking down. I had no idea what had happened, and I knew I was in a lot of pain, but they said, can you get on the stretcher? And I got on the stretcher. I didn't know, but what happened was I was walking down. I just passed out from exhaustion. As I fell, I whacked my ribs on the armrest, broke a few ribs. But I'm in the ambulance going back, and one of the paramedics says, what day of the week is it, Steve? And I said, October, November? I had no idea. And he said, what month of the year is it? I said, Saturday, I think. Where have you just come from? I didn't even know. And that was a real wake-up call for me. And I thought, okay, because I remember going to hospital, MRI scans and all that type of thing, because I'd had cancer twice, and all of a sudden everything's sort of getting on top of me, and I'm thinking, Steve, you've got to start looking after yourself, because if I can't look after myself, I can't help other people.
We've worked together a few times on the show and on the various Bachelor things, and it's always fascinating watching the way you work. And you have spoken to me, and you mentioned it earlier, that the ability to do what you do so very, very well has made it hard for people to be close to you. That must be tough.
Yeah, look, I remember my wife would come to a speaking presentation, and people would often ask her, how do you deal with the fact that your husband is a human lie detector? And I think, look, here's the thing. I mean, believe me, I'll switch off. There's absolutely no benefit in me going into a social environment or social context, challenging every time I hear somebody lying. I remember I was in New Jersey. I was doing work for CNN, and I was in New Jersey, and I was invited to a party. Anyway, what happened was there's about 30, 40 people there, and someone says, this is Steve Van Aperen, the human lie detector. You can tell when you're lying. And so this woman, who incidentally her husband was there with her, said, okay, I want you to test me. I had an affair. Am I telling the truth or not? Now, just think about that for a second. If I start asking her questions about that, and let's just say she has, and it looks like to me she's lying, and I tell her why I believe she's lying. Think of the collateral damage that could do, right? But if I avoid it, and just for the sake of maintaining peace and harmony in that environment, I say, oh, no, it's fine. Then they're going to say, well, he's useless. He doesn't know what he's doing. What benefit or value can come in a social context where you're constantly challenging people about whether they're telling the truth or lying? I don't see any. Having said that, if I'm interviewing you for a homicide, I will peel you layer by layer, but I'll do it with laser precision, and you won't know which way to go. I will slowly pull every one of your alibis or stories apart. I don't care how well prepared someone is. You cannot possibly pre-anticipate every question I'm likely to ask you.
I am so grateful that you can do that, because that's a skill set that is I'm surely a lot of people really need. And you said you find you can switch off when you're in a social situation. You mentioned it earlier, watching that interview with the member of the monarchy coming into an election year. You said before, people avoiding the question. Do you just want to throw the remote through the TV when Lee Sales says, "Okay, so tell us about your energy policy," and they go, "Our energy policy. Well, as far as refugees are concerned, blah 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 blah." It's like, come on. It must make you so frustrated.
It frustrates me just as much as everyone else out there. And it's a typical diversionary tactic where, the question's too hard, I don't like, and then all of a sudden, and in the media, as they're always looking for short grabs, make America great again, all those sort of things. When people start challenging their policy, how are you going to do it? Where are you going to find the funding? I often think there's no such thing as a bad interviewee, but there's definitely such a thing as a bad interviewer. Why? Because they don't ask the right questions. If and I'm going to relate back to a homicide case. I remember Richard Carlton from 60 Minutes contacted me a few years ago, and he said, "Look, Steve, we would like you to do an interview and a polygraph on a person by the name of Greg Domasavage." Now, for your listeners, Greg Domasavage was charged with the murder of Jaden Lesky in Moe around about 20 years ago now. Anyway, at that stage, Jaden had not been found. What had happened was Domasavage had said that he'd left the house, left Jaden in the house, a young boy, and come back, and there was a pig's head in the front of the garden. The window was cracked, but no Jaden. So they said, "Can you ask him in a interview on polygraph test whether or not he knows for certain where Jaden's body is?" And I said, that's a terrible question. And he said, "Why? Surely if he killed him, he'd know where the body is." I said, "Not necessarily. What if he had an accomplice and the accomplice disposed of the body? What if he threw the body off the bridge and it's 20 kilometres down the river? He may legitimately not know where the body is. That doesn't mean he wasn't involved in the murder." So in any interview, if the questions are not clear and concise, it will allow a deceptive person room to wriggle through. Another example, more recently, I was asked by the homicide squad to conduct an interview and a test, and the short version was they found the deceased in a dam. But when I read the forensic pathologist's autopsy, they could not establish the cause of death. So one of the investigators said, "Steve, we've got a prime suspect, a main person of interest. Can you ask him if he strangled the victim?" I said, "Oh, that's not a good question." He said, "Why? He'd know if he strangled him." I said, "Actually, that's not the issue. The autopsy couldn't establish a cause of death. So what if he held him underwater and he drowned? And I ask him in a test, did you strangle the victim?" Technically, he's not lying. He'll pass that test, even though he's involved. So the correct question would be, were you involved in any way in the murder of or the death of? So and get back to the interviews of politicians, what I see is sometimes a question will be asked, the respondent or the interview won't answer, and then they'll go on to the next question. Well, what's the point of asking the question in the first place? So I would like to see more journalists actually go back and ask the direct questions.
I would like to see more journalists go to the Steve Van Aperen School of holding people to account. Your Walkley Award is waiting for you to spend some time with Steve. I'm telling you.
Just a funny point on that. I won't mention the network, but years ago I was contacted by a journalist and who'd actually been to one of my training courses. And he said, "Look, I'm trying to get the hierarchy to get you to run a training course for our news reporters." I said, "Sure." And anyway, he rings me back. So I sent him all the information. He rings me back quite despondent. He said, "Oh, look, the head of news said, look, this guy's not a journalist. What would he know about interviewing?"
Amazing. Oh, Steve. Well, I'm grateful, Steve, that you're not keeping this stuff to yourself. I'm grateful that not only have you written books about it, but you also teach people. By spreading this information and letting other people learn how to do what you do, what are you trying to achieve?
Well, I think the reason I joined the police initially was because I don't like injustice. I don't like seeing people ripped off or hurt or getting away with things that they shouldn't. So I think it was, believe it or not, it was quite altruistic. It was really funny because I remember when the very first day I joined at the academy, they're going around the room and they said to people, "Why did you join?" and all the rest of it. And I'm listening to all these answers. People said, "Oh, I want to help the community," and all the rest of it. And I thought, cut the bullshit. You're already in there. Anyway, it gets to me, and the instructor said, "Steve, why did you join?" I said, "To meet girls." And everyone just cracked up laughing. But the point was, having the knowledge in being able to decipher people who are bad or good, or people who are deliberately, intentionally misleading you, is a powerful tool that can save a lot of heartache. What I see, especially in relationships, all the signs are there, all the cues are there. I remember interviewing, and I felt terribly sorry for her. I remember speaking to a woman, and her husband, quite a senior person in the community, had, I think it was about 100 gigabytes of child pornography on his computer. And yet his wife had absolutely no idea. So, I think what can be obtained, I think, people can use it to protect themselves.
Mate, I'm so fascinated by the work you do, and I'm so grateful with how generous you've been speaking about your experience and what you've learned. And I'm really grateful that you shared that with us, mate. Despite how grim it is to talk about the stuff that we talk about today, it's important to understand that it does happen in our community. But I'm grateful that there's many people like you who work very, very hard to help people who are affected by things like this. And I think it's really important to remember that for all of us,
Yeah, I think life is short. Live your life, enjoy your life. Don't sweat all the small stuff, because at the end of the day is life and death and everything in between. So enjoy it.